E5. Knight F3. Knight C6. Bishop B5. Knight F6. Castle kingside. Knight takes E4. D4. Knight D6. Bishop takes C6. D takes C6. D takes E5. Knight F5. Queen takes D8 check. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. King takes D8. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. H3, out of opening book, Rook D1, check, would have been in the Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, book opening. King E8. Knight C3. Knight E7. Knight E4. Knight G6. Rook E1. H6. King H2. C5. C4. Bishop E6. Threatens White's pawn at C4 and blocks White's pawn at E5. B3. Removes the threat on White's pawn at C4. B6. G4. H5. King G3. Rook D8. Takes control of the open file. Knight E G5. Bishop C8. Bishop B2. Bishop E7. Rook A D1. Rook takes D1. Rook takes D1. H takes G4. Attacks White's knight at F3 and isolates White's pawn at H3. H takes G4. Protects White's knight at F3. F6. Threatens White's knight at G5. E takes F6. Removes the threat on White's knight at G5. Forks Black's bishop at E7 and Black's pawn at G7 and isolates Black's pawn at G7. G takes F6. Removes the threat on Black's bishop at E7 and threatens White's knight at G5. Black wins a rook and 2 pawns for a rook and 2 pawns. Material is even. Rook E1 pins Black's bishop at E7. King F8 frees Black's bishop at E7 from the pin. Knight E4 moves it to safety. King F7. Bishop C1. Rook G8. Rook H1. Bishop B7. Attacks White's knight at E4. Rook E1. Protects White's knight at E4. Rook E8. Knight Fd2. Knight E5. Bishop B2. Knight D3. Forks White's rook and White's bishop. Rook B1. Moves it to safety and removes the threat on White's bishop. Rook G8. King F3. Knight takes B2. Rook takes B2. White wins a knight for a bishop. Material is even. Bishop c8. g5. f5. Attacks White's knight at e4. Knight f6. Moves it out of immediate jeopardy and attacks Black's rook. Rook takes g5. Attacks White's knight at f6 with 2 pieces and isolates White's pawn at f2. Black wins a pawn. Knight d5. Moves it to safety and threatens Black's pawn at c7. Bishop b7. Pins White's knight at d5 and protects Black's pawn at c7. Rook b1. Rook g4. Rook h1. Seizes the open file. Bishop d6. King e2. Rook d4. Rook h7. Check. Frees White's knight at d5 from the pin and checks Black's king. King g6. Moves it out of check and attacks White's rook. Rook d7. Moves it to safety. Bishop takes d5. Disengages the pin on Black's pawn at c7. C takes d5. Rook takes d5. Black wins a knight and a pawn for a bishop. Knight c4. Blocks Black's pawn at c5. b5. Attacks White's knight. Knight takes d6. Forks Black's pawn at c7 and Black's pawn at b5. C takes d6. Removes the threat on Black's pawn at b5 and creates a passed pawn on d6. Rook takes a7. White wins a bishop and a pawn for a knight. Black is up a pawn in material. b4. a4. B takes a3 en passant. Creates a passed pawn on a3 and isolates White's pawn at b3. Rook takes a3. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Rook e5 check. Checks White's king. King d3. Moves it out of check. King g5. Rook a6. Attacks Black's pawn at d6. Rook e1. King d2. Attacks Black's rook. Rook e6. Moves it to safety and protects Black's pawn at d6. Rook b6. King g4. b4. C takes b4. Creates a passed pawn on b4. Rook takes b4. Check. Checks Black's king. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn. King f3. Moves it out of check, threatens White's pawn, and blocks White's pawn. King d1. f4. Rook d4. Rook e4. Attacks White's rook. Rook d2. Moves it to safety and protects White's pawn. d5. Advances the passed pawn. Rook a2. King g2. The game ends with no result.